The Mandalorian started into its third season this week, which is why I took it as the topic for this week's Blender project. My idea was to recreate the classic Star Wars scene where a spaceship appears out of hyperspace, flies past the camera, and by that reveals a new planet. Again, I gave myself the challenge of completing the whole project in just one day. For that, I looked online for a good model of Mando's starfighter. The only realistic enough model I could find costs $28, which unfortunately was out of my budget. So I instead decided to take this free model and adjust it to my needs. Probably the main thing I wanted to do was to redo the textures. For that, I chose a simple metal texture as a base. I then set up the lighting with an HDRI and a sun lamp. I then overlaid a second metal grunge map to get some more interesting results. For the turbines, I took a simple image of some machine parts and used the cube projection method to generate the UVs. This looked surprisingly good. The same method I used for other parts of the spaceship. I then added some thickness and a new shader to the cockpit glass. To match Mando's starfighter more closely, I had to do some model changes to the turbines. The new glass shader revealed the lack of interior, so I added some simple geometry to that. I also took the cockpit interior of the F-35 model I used for last week's video and placed it in the starfighter. I then found a model of Grogu and Mando online and put them in the spaceship as well. Since I knew that would probably not be seen that clearly in the final scene, I didn't bother to rig and post them. To create the engine, I used a video clip of a blowing torch and applied it to the cylinder. I then tinted it even more blue, but made sure to preserve the bright inside part. After duplicating the cylinder, I rotated it and offset the video clip to break the repetition. I then placed it on all the engines of the starfighter. So with just 1 hour of work, especially redoing the textures, I went from this model to this, which looks a lot more like the one Mando is flying in the show. In a fresh new Blender scene, I parented the spaceship to an empty and animated it flying in a straight line. I also created a second empty and used the track 2 constraint to have the camera follow it. This way I could much more easily control the camera movement. I then created a circle which I used in the background as a placeholder for the planet. I also created the jump out of hyperspace in the very beginning. Through looking at some Mandalorian scenes, I decided to give the spaceship a bit of rotation just to make it look more interesting. To light the scene, I turned the background not to completely black, but to a very dark grey. This way you could still see details in the shadow. I then also added a sun lamp. The reflections now looked a bit wrong, so I adjusted the roughness map. To create the star background, I first used a light path node to mix between the black stark background and the dark grey background. I then used the noise texture and the color ramp to create the star field. With the Voronoi texture, I created some few bigger stars I then added on top. With motion blur active, I then did my first test render, which I took into Photoshop to give it a grade. After that, I went on to making the planet. My original plan was to create it with AI using Midjourney. I haven't used it before, so I had to watch some tutorials first. After 1 hour of trying different prompts, I still hadn't come up with anything close to what I had in mind. I even uploaded screenshots directly from the show and told it to recreate it in high quality. But the results weren't what I was looking for, so I instead decided to do it myself in Blender. Since I haven't done planets in over a year, I watched multiple tutorials on that. I ended up using this tutorial for the surface texture and this for the clouds and atmosphere. So in about 1 hour I came up with this result, which was what I was looking for in the first place. Instead of importing this whole planet into Blender, which would have increased the render time dramatically for each frame, I instead just rendered out one image and used the import images as planes in Blender to place it in the back. I just made sure to save the render as a 30-bit EXR file. Rendering it with transparent background did not really work with the atmosphere, so I instead used a gradient texture set to spherical to remove the black background. As a last step, I added a glare node in the compositor. The rest I would grade in DaVinci Resolve. Rendering out just one frame took under 1 minute, so I decided to render it out in 4K overnight. 7 hours later I had this result. As always, There are a few small things I would keep working on, but overall I'm quite happy with the result.